In today's video, I'll be sharing a guide to attending Edinburgh Festival Fringe for first-timers, with plenty of tips and must-knows, so you can experience this fever dream of unbridled creativity in the most stress-free possible way. Known as the world's largest performing arts festival, the Edinburgh Festival Fringe is a legendary event that takes place over 3 weeks every August in glorious Edinburgh, Scotland. But how does the event work? How do you actually buy tickets? And how do you choose between the 3,000 plus shows that make up the program every year? Well, this video is here to answer all your questions. In case you're new here, hi, I'm Christina from happytowander.com. And this channel is all about practical travel tips from someone who's been there, done that. In this case, I actually spent a month in Edinburgh last year for the Fringe, and I loved it so much that I'm going back this year. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, be sure to like and subscribe for more travel videos just like this one. Now, just to clarify, this is a video about attending the Fringe and not about performing or putting on a show, because clearly nobody would buy a ticket to this. In any case, I hope you find it helpful. Now, let's get started with a brief introduction to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. While today it is considered one of the most exciting cultural events and a highlight of the Edinburgh Festival season, the origins of the Fringe can actually be traced back to my personal favorite justification for anything, which is spite. Back in 1947, the first Edinburgh International Festival was organized to celebrate performing arts. At this time, 8 companies were so rattled by their lack of invite that they decided to just set up their own shows on the fringes of this main event. Today, honoring this concept, at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, anybody can come put on a show, so long as they have the funds and the venue, of course. This festival has grown to be so huge that every year there's now 3,000 plus shows of every genre and type that you can imagine, ranging from comedy, a musical theater, to magic, circus, everything. And during this time, theaters, bars, nightclubs, restaurants, even hotel conference rooms become venues for entertainment. There's truly nothing like it. It is so, so cool. As such, there isn't a single venue for the Edinburgh Fringe. It's really just scattered all around the city and frankly, pretty impossible to dodge. No matter where you go in the city, you're bound to see tons of flyers, tons of posters, and people will probably be handing you flyers as you're walking around. And there's buskers every few steps, especially along the touristy stretches like the Royal Mile. Some of the most popular areas, though, that have plenty of action include Bristow Square, which is home to the Pleasance Dome, McEwen Hall, and one of the Gilded Balloon's many venues. There's also the Pleasance Courtyard, which has over 20 different halls, and George Square, home to many venues, including the iconic upside-down cow known as the Udderbelly. Besides just the Fringe though, do beware that August is festival season in Edinburgh, so there's going to be a ton of other really cool events and festivals happening at the same time, which means, of course, more crowds, but also more fun. So some of the events that you can look forward to include the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo, the Edinburgh International Festival, of course, the Edinburgh Book Festival, as well as others like the Edinburgh Festival of Politics and the Whiskey Fringe. All right, now that you know the basics of the Fringe and where to find it, now we're going to move on to a very important section, which is how to get tickets. The most important thing that I can stress is that when it comes to the Fringe, you're never buying a ticket for the entire festival. Rather, you are buying tickets for an individual show or performance. Of course, there's like thousands of them happening at once, so you're not going to be able to see them all. Now, most tickets are general admission, which means there's no assigned seat. So usually you'll get a ticket to a show, then you line up, and that's going to decide where you sit. Now, these tickets can be purchased really easily either online at edfringe.com, through their app, through individual venue websites, and you can also get tickets in person at the main Fringe box office, which is located at the Old Assembly Close. You can also usually get tickets at the actual venues themselves, which have their own box offices. Do note that all shows do use e-tickets these days, which means even when you do buy tickets in person, you're basically just going to get that ticket through an email, and then you're going to get a QR code that's scanned once they start checking tickets. Now, generally speaking, the program of shows at the Fringe is released in batches. So for instance, this year, the first round of shows was released on February 22nd. The second round of shows was released on April 4th. And the third round of shows was released on May 9th, with the full program being launched on June 12th. So if you're looking for a highly sought after act, make sure you are going on the official Fringe website to see when these shows are being announced, just so you know when to be ready to buy tickets. Now, I would highly advise booking tickets in advance for any really big names or big acts that you expect to sell out. I would also book a lot of tickets in advance if you're planning on visiting during a peak period, like a weekend. That said, to get the full Fringe experience, I do think it's important to leave some room for spontaneity. Some of my favorite days from the Fringe last year were when we just went to the festival site, talked to some people about their favorite shows, and got recommendations through word of mouth or through flyers, and then just kind of went with the flow to go see different shows throughout the day. This is definitely a huge part of the Fringe experience, in addition to buying shows that you already know, so definitely have space for both. Now, the good news is, with thousands of shows happening throughout the festival, it's not going to be hard for you to get tickets to something. So the next question is, how do you find out about which shows are worth watching? How do you pick which shows to go to? So there are a few different main places that you can go to look at the program and to find out about shows. Now, the first one is, of course, the official website, as well as the official app. There's also official brochures that you can pick up at all the different venues, and these can be really fun to flick through and browse. There's also tons of flyers and posters literally on every surface around the city, so it's not going to be hard to get different ideas. And what's quite fun is actually, as the festival goes on, these posters will get modified with positive reviews or star ratings and things like that, so you can kind of see over time which shows have a lot of hype around them. You'll of course also get tons of flyers from people who are flyering all throughout the city. This was definitely a huge shock to me. I didn't realize just how many people there would be just handing out flyers for different shows. It's a huge part of the experience. So for me, I always accept a flyer and then I just kind of keep a stack and flick through them later. I mean, there's no harm in grabbing one, so that's definitely something to look out for. Of course, there's also word of mouth. So one of the things I really enjoyed about the Fringe is that it just seems like such a lively and friendly atmosphere. So when you're just hanging out around the city, often you'll strike up conversations with strangers and you'll ask them, oh, have you seen anything good lately? And you'll just kind of bond over the different shows that you've seen. So this is definitely one of my favorite ways to learn about different shows to go see, just kind of chatting with strangers and seeing what they recommend. But of course, if you're looking for a more official recommendation, there's also reviewers online that you can read as well. It goes without saying though, art is probably one of the most subjective things in the world, so I personally take reviews with a grain of salt. I've seen a few shows that had great reviews that I didn't love, and shows that didn't have great reviews that I personally thought were really good. So rather than just rely on reviews alone, I think a better approach is to just read the different show descriptions and see what resonates and what calls to you, and going to see that. At the end of the day, even if it's bad, you get a good story out of it. And trust me, I have many bad stories. Now, if you're indecisive and you're not set on seeing any particular act, it might be worth your while to go see a best of show. There's quite a few of these for different genres, different types of shows, but essentially these are shows that combine various acts into 1 hour or an hour and a half. But of course, not all best of shows are made equal. So if you're looking for a best of show and you're hoping to guarantee that you're gonna see some good acts, then I would take a look at some of the more prestigious venues, some of the bigger production companies, rather than like a hotel conference room, which is what I did, and it was probably the worst show I saw all Fringe. On the other hand, if you're looking for shows with a bit more polish, or you're kind of looking for something that's kind of guaranteed to be good, then I would definitely recommend looking at shows that have maybe already been performed in other places. Because sometimes acts will actually bring established shows that they've performed elsewhere in other cities, bring that to the Fringe. So you can look into those, and then that way there's definitely a lot more reviews. There might even be video previews and things that you can look at so that you have an idea of what to expect. Now let's move on to the next important section, which is how to get a good deal on tickets. Now, if you're trying to do Edinburgh Fringe on a budget, the good news is there's actually a lot of different ways that you can get half-price tickets. You just need to know where to look. If you're visiting early on in the festival, there's actually a few days that are 2-for-1 days. Usually this is just to incentivize people to come to the show early so they can get a bit of buzz around the different shows. And you can easily find these on the official edfringe.com website by filtering out ticket price types and looking specifically for the 2-for-1. There's also the Half Price Hut, which actually opens on the first Wednesday of the festival after these 2-for-1 days are over. And this is of course where they'll be selling tickets for shows happening on that day or sometimes for the next morning, and the tickets are half price. And what I really love about this is they actually have the list of shows that they have tickets available for on their websites, and it's going to give you a list for that day. That way you can kind of pick out which shows you'd be interested in buying the half price tickets for, and then you can go get them at the box office. Finally, if you go to some of the larger venues that I mentioned before, oftentimes I found that on the chalkboards, they'll actually write out which shows have 2-for-1 tickets available. So that could be another way to get cheap tickets if you're already there. I should also mention, if you feel like being a patron of the arts, then there's also 2-for-1 Fringe tickets if you become a friend of the Fringe. That of course does entail paying a membership fee. So if you're on a budget, that's probably not going to be the best solution, but just know that it is a possibility. Better than half price, there's also the Free Fringe, which, true to its name, offers a program of shows that are either non-ticketed or have free entry. Now do beware though, when we say free, of course it's not completely free. What they mean by that is usually these shows will be pay as you want at the end. So you don't have to pay anything for a ticket, but at the end they will ask you to pay what you thought that show was worth. Now, having done a few of these free shows, I will say I don't always think that they're worth it, just because oftentimes the lineups for these free shows are absolutely ridiculous and you're not guaranteed entry. And in the end, you do need to pay anyway. If you're short on time, I do think it's more worth your while to just buy a ticket for something that you know you're going to be interested in, rather than gambling with something in the Free Fringe where you're not really sure if it's going to be very good, and you often have to wait a long time in line for it as well. Overall though, when you're looking at tickets, I do advise you do not book shows back to back, just because you do need time to navigate between venues, and sometimes shows will run overtime. And I would also recommend booking varied shows in different venues to get a more well-rounded Fringe experience overall. So don't just book comedy, book a few things that are out of your comfort zone, book some music or book some circus, just so that you can see like all the different things that the Fringe has to offer, because it's such a special place. Like there's really anything that you can dream of, you can probably go watch at the Fringe. So don't just limit yourself to the same type of show at the same venue. This way you get to explore more of the festival and just have a more well-rounded experience overall. All right, now finally, let's tackle some Edinburgh Fringe tips for first-time attendees. Just general tips, survival tips that I had to learn the hard way that I think could help a lot of first-timers out. So the first one is kind of more respect thing, but I should say, do remember to be as nice and respectful as possible to locals. I have heard time and time again that the Fringe is an incredibly tough time to be living in Edinburgh, especially if you're working in hospitality, just because it's so busy and it's impossible to get anywhere. So do remember that at the end of the day, you are a guest and a visitor in the city, so try your best to be a respectful visitor. So if you're in a residential area, don't be screaming at the top of your lungs. If you're walking on the sidewalk, don't just stop abruptly to take a photo. Remember to have some awareness, because even though this is a bucket list item for you and you're having the time of your life, this is also daily life for a lot of locals. So try to make it as easy on them as you can. The next very, very important tip is, if you're planning on coming to the Fringe, do book your accommodation and travel plans as soon as you possibly can. Because frankly, the price of accommodation in Edinburgh during the Fringe is out of this world outrageous. It is ridiculous how expensive it gets, because if you think about it, it's not just about the millions of visitors that come see the Fringe, it's also about all the performers that are putting on these thousands of shows. So really, accommodation is highly limited, especially if you're looking for something that's quite affordable. So this year we booked our hotel back in February, and we were already down to some of the last relatively affordable options. So as soon as you know you want to go, I would say book those hotels, even if it's a refundable one, just to make sure you have something. If you're looking for a longer term stay, do note that with short-term lets in Edinburgh, it is required that places have a license for it. So be sure to double check that the places you're renting from are licensed, and also be on the lookout on Facebook groups. That's actually a really great place where locals will say, hey, I'm renting out my place for the duration of the Fringe, here's my license number, etc. And the group that I'm part of is just called Edinburgh Fringe Accommodation. And there's a ton of activity in there, even quite last minute. So that's definitely worth looking into if you're going to be in the city for a few weeks or more. Now, my next tip is to make sure you download the Edinburgh Fringe app. So this app is really handy for looking at all the different shows in one place. You can buy tickets. You can also heart and star shows for the future. And once you get tickets, you can add it into a schedule so that you can see all your tickets at a glance. And that's really, really helpful once you start buying tickets, because honestly, it's not uncommon to have like 4 or 5 shows in a day. I will say this app has been quite glitchy for me in the past, but honestly, as a one-stop shop resource, there's really nothing else that compares. Now, another important tip for first-timers to the Edinburgh Fringe, one of the most common traps that they fall into is confusing the event production company name with the venue name. So here's your warning. Usually when you look at the name of the venue, it's typically the latter half of the venue that matters more. So for instance, Pleasance, Gilded Balloon, Assembly, those are all names of production companies that run different venues across the city. So the Pleasance Dome, for instance, isn't actually next to the Pleasance Courtyard. Those are 2 separate venues, so don't get them mixed up. Same goes for the Assembly Hall and the Assembly Rooms. Even though they sound like they should be in the same place, they're not. So definitely double check the actual location of the venue before you go. It's very easy to get them mixed up. Another important tip is to get to venues early, especially really big ones that have a lot of rooms and individual venues within them, because it can be really tough to find your way around. And again, because it's usually not assigned seating, the earlier you are in the queue, the better the seat you get. So you don't want to be lost and kind of like walking in circles, because then you might get stuck in the back. Although I will say for certain comedy shows, you probably don't want to get there too early, because if you're in the first few rows, that puts you at risk of, audience participation that you might not necessarily want. Now, the next tip in terms of what to wear is, I will say the Fringe is pretty casual, so you can get away with wearing pretty much anything to the shows, but a lot of venues can get really, really warm and there's not a lot of space for you to bring stuff. So do try to pack light, don't bring a giant bag, because in a lot of the smaller venues, it's just fold-out chairs, so there's not really gonna be a place for you to put a giant bag. And also the venues can get really hot because it's a ton of people crammed in close quarters. So do pack light and bring stuff that's quite easy to remove, so that if you get too hot, then you can just, take off your hoodie or whatever, rather than just be sweating the whole time. I'd also advise you bring a portable charger or at least a USB cable, just because you're gonna need your phone for a lot, especially since your tickets are on your phone. And if you're out all day, you're gonna need a place to charge it, and everyone else is gonna be needing to charge their phone, so it'll be quite tough to find a power outlet. So be sure to bring a portable charger, or at least bring a USB cable. In a pinch, you can charge them actually on the Edinburgh buses. They tend to have USB ports now, which is very handy. Now, another thing is you should definitely make sure to take care of things bathroom-wise before shows, because venues will typically have bathrooms on site, but it's really awkward trying to leave in the middle of a performance. So make sure that's all taken care of. Another thing I would advise is getting cash out as well in advance of performances if you're planning on going to any of those pay-as-you-want shows, just because even though a lot of performers do take card these days, it is really awkward telling someone to their face how much you think their art is worth. So I think it's much easier to just put down a 10-pound bill or a 5-pound bill, whatever it is, rather than look them in the eye and be like, thank you, I would like to give you £5 for that. So if you're awkward like me, make sure you have cash, because otherwise it's a super awkward situation. I'll also say don't count on having internet, because based on personal experience, it feels like in a lot of the venues, especially when they're really crowded, it can be tough to get service. So I would advise preparing as if you wouldn't have internet. So have screenshots of your tickets, for instance, have a designated meeting place with your friends, have the directions to your venue also saved on an offline map, things like that, because based on personal experience, whenever you need the data most is when it's not going to work. I will say though, if for some reason your phone does die or you don't have internet and you can't access your tickets, this actually did happen to us at one show, and it seems like for a lot of the venues, the people working there actually have access to a guest list of people who have purchased tickets. So in those cases, they can just look you up in the system and they'll let you in. Now, lastly, don't stress and just remember to have fun. I remember I was really nervous before my first Fringe because I'd heard so many reports of how crazy busy it gets and how overwhelming it is. And apart from the absolute hellscape that is the Royal Mile, I honestly didn't think it was that bad. Sure, it got very busy on the weekends, but honestly, I found the crowds to be fairly manageable, because at the end of the day, yes, there's thousands and thousands of people in the city for the festival, but if you think about it, they're mainly just locked away in the venues watching shows. So it's really not as bad as some people make it out to be, especially if you plan for weekdays rather than weekends, which is what I highly recommend doing. All right, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that guide, and be sure to like and subscribe for more travel videos just like this one. I'll see you guys next week. Bye!